Good afternoon, friends, and welcome to the EduSec Network. Our topic of discussion today is Indian Federalism, Retrospect and Prospect, from centralization through regionalization to federalization. And for this discussion, we have with us in our studio Dr. M.P. Singh, a retired professor of political science, University of Delhi. He has a teaching experience of more than 4 decades in the field. And with this introduction, I would like to welcome Sir. Thank you so much, Sir, for coming. And I request you to begin our today's lecture.
Thank you, Roshi. The topic for today's lecture is very topical. There is a great deal of discussion on federalism in India today, at least since 1989. The Indian Constitution is parliamentary federal right from the beginning, but the process of federalization has really started later. Initially, the federal components of the Constitution were not so active or not so operational. It was only subsequently that parliamentary centralism has been sort of somewhat moderated by rise of federal forces in the country. Now, very briefly, we must begin with defining the term. Federalism is a new form of a state pioneered by the United States of America in 1787. This American Constitution modified the concept of modern state which had emerged out of the treaties of Westphalia. This treaty was signed in Europe following the 30-year war and collapse of the Holy Roman Empire. And the collapse of this empire gave birth to embryonic nation states. They were states to begin with, and gradually they developed into nation states out of an imperial entity. Now, Westphalian state was a different kind of entity, and federal state is a different kind of entity. Westphalian state was based on the principle of unified sovereignty and unified territoriality. The federal state, on the other hand, is based on divided sovereignty and divided territoriality, and in the case of United States, dual citizenship. Sovereignty and territory divided between the federal government and the state governments, and dual citizenship. American citizens are at the same time citizens of the United States and citizens of their respective states. Now, so that's, and federalism is based on division of powers between the federal government and the state government, such that it's possible to have a shared rule at the center and self-rule in the regions. Now, just as the USA in 1789 pioneered in devising the first presidential federal system, Canada pioneered the first parliamentary federal system. There is difference between presidential federalism and parliamentary federalism, and the classical example of the former is the United States, and that of the latter, Canada. India in 1950 has adopted the Canadian model of federalism. Now, why federalism? Federalism, why a federal form of government or federal form of constitution is adopted? There are a number of motivations, a number of reasons why a country would prefer to adopt a federal constitution. Number one, there may be need for accommodation of diversity. If a country is multicultural or multinational, a federal form of constitution is desirable for it, because a unitary state would not be able to reflect the federal character of the society. Federalism may also be preferred by a number of states if they are threatened by external threat, external aggression. In fact, one American writer on federalism, William Riker, has offered a military explanation of federal formation. If there is a military threat, if there is a threat of foreign aggression, the threatened states may join hands to defend themselves against the external threat. Federalism may also be adopted for economy of scale and prosperity through trade, national or international, national and international. Because federalism allows for a larger internal market, a larger national market, and it makes possible both a trade within the nation as well as trade, international trade with outside countries. Another motivation or another reason why federal form of government may be preferred is for promotion of democracy and liberty through constitutionalism. The founders of the American Republic, in fact, argued that they are going ahead for a federal constitution because it will protect their liberties and freedoms better than a unitary state, and it would make possible constitutional governance. Now, with these preliminary observations, we would now focus on India, and we would try to contextualize the federal idea in the Indian context. Now, a tradition of multi-level governance and republican states in ancient India and feudal or segmentary states in medieval North India and South India had existed in the past. Any state, any large state in India has been a multi-level structure. Mauryan state or the Mughal state or the British colonial state had at least three levels of governance or three levels of government, the central level, the regional level, and the local level. Now, but these pre-independence states, these multi-level governments in pre-independence India cannot be called federal, because federalism presupposes a particular form of government which is based on democratic values, which is created under a constitutional contract. A written constitution is considered necessary for federalism. These features are not found in the Mauryan state or the Mughal state or the British colonial state, and for that reason we cannot call them federal in the true sense of the term, even though they give the impression of multi-level structure of government which is common to federalism. But what is not found there is a constitutional division of powers between the federal and the regional governments, which cannot be altered at the sweet will of the central authority, or for that reason by a revolt or rebellion by the regional authorities. The patterns, policies and constitutional reforms brought about by the British Raj can be traced as the earlier steps towards federalism in India. the first step towards federalism in India was taken during the British India. The British India was highly centralized, unitary structure of a state, colonial state was there. But the British tried to introduce the first federal constitution in India in 1935. The Government of India Act 1935 was the first federal constitution in modern India, but the federal part of the constitution could never be put into effect, could never be operationalized, because the Federal Union of 1935 was supposed to be a union between British Indian provinces and the princely states of India, the Deshi Riyashats or the princely states of India, and the princely rulers decided not to join the federation, and the 1935 Constitution Act had stipulated that only if at least 50% of princely rulers decided to join the union, the federal part of the constitution would be operationalized. But the provincial part of the constitution in British Indian provinces was operationalized in 1935. In 1936, the first elections under the 1935 constitution were held in 1936, and provincial ministries were formed in all the British Indian provinces. Provincial governments were formed under the federal constitution of 1935, where the reserve subjects were ruled, reserve subjects were dealt with by the colonial bureaucracy, the Governor General and the Governor and their officers, whereas transferred subjects were administered by elected ministers under the 1935 Government of India Act. Major landmarks of federal constitutional discourse and reforms in British India can be briefly highlighted here. The first important federal document in British India was Motilal Nehru Committee Report 1928. The committee was appointed by an all parties conference in which all political parties in British India, colonial India, assembled in a conference and appointed this committee to draft a constitution for British India. This Motilal Nehru Committee report put forward the blueprint of a federal India as a British dominion, as the British dominion similar to Canada and Australia. The roundtable conferences in the 1930s, early 1930s, that the British held with the Indian rulers. In these conferences, the federal idea was articulated, put forward before the Indian political leadership, including princely states of India, and there was some debate and deliberations on it. Then the Cabinet Mission Plan 1946 was another step. The next round of reforms after 1935 were being deliberated, but then the freedom struggle, after the freedom struggle around after the Second World War reached a decisive stage, and the British rulers, the imperial government in London, put forward another proposal for a confederal India. It was a proposal for confederal India, mind you, not federal but confederal. A confederal government is one in which states are more powerful. A federal government is one in which the center and the states have meaningfully demarcated jurisdiction, and the central government is generally given workable, decisive powers such that the powers of the federal government and powers of the state governments are both meaningful. But in a confederal government, center is very weak, rather weak, and this confederal constitution was put forward by British India in order to appeal to the Muslim League and the princely rulers who did not want a strong center in India. The Muslim majority provinces where Muslim League was powerful wanted a constitution in which the center would be weak and the provinces would be strong, residual powers would belong to the provinces, and the princely rulers would also consider such a constitution in which the units, princely estates, would have a great deal of power. So the British tried to make a last-ditch effort to preserve the unity of India after independence, but this plan also failed because the Congress initially accepted it, Muslim League also grudgingly accepted it, but subsequently Muslim League rejected it out of hand, and the Congress also subsequently rejected it, much later though, after the rejection of Muslim League, and the cabinet mission plan was overtaken by the Mountbatten plan for partition of India, and independence came in India with partition of the country into India and Pakistan. And India and Pakistan were granted independence under an act of parliament, and the relevant act for us enacted by the British Parliament for our independence is the Independence of India Act 1947. And then the cabinet mission plan also had a proposal, a scheme for election of a constituent assembly to draft constitution for India, and elections to the constituent assembly were held in 1946, and it was this constituent assembly that drafted the Constitution of India under which we are governed today. Now, after the partition became inevitable and the Pakistani parts of India, were bifurcated, and and the Indian part of the Constituent Assembly then proceeded to draft a federal constitution of India, federal constitution for India with a strong center. And under the Constitution of India, the central authorities have been given, considerable power. So independent India finally opted for a constitution with a strong parliamentary center, but meaningful powers to the states as well. Now, what is the what are the patterns of division of powers and what is the structure of governments in the Constitution? That should be briefly mentioned here. The 7th schedule in the Constitution contains 3 lists: the union list, the state list, the concurrent list. The subjects in the union list are the ones on which the Parliament of India has power to make laws. Subjects in the state list are the ones on which the state legislatures have exclusive power to make laws. The concurrent subjects in the 3rd list are the ones on which both the Parliament as well as the state legislatures are competent to make laws. Both can make laws, but if there is a conflict between the laws made by the Parliament and those made by the state legislatures, laws made by the Parliament would prevail. the structure of government under the Constitution is such that both at the union level or the central level and at the state level, the form of government is representative and responsible government. Governments at both the levels are elected by the people, they are representative of the people, and they are responsible governments in the sense that they are responsible to the legislature at both the levels. So the parliamentary form of government is introduced at both the levels. Cabinets accountable to the legislatures. An important development in Indian Constitution is the doctrine of, judicial doctrine of unamendability of the basic structure of the Constitution, which is propounded by the Supreme Court of India, under which the amending power of the Parliament is limited to amendment and fundamental departures such that basic features of the Constitution would be altered or not permissible under the constitutional law of India. Now, what has been the trajectory of development or evolution of the federal part of the Constitution or the federal structure in the country? India has moved from what is called quasi-federalism to federalism. Soon after the promulgation of the Constitution in 1952, in fact, right at the time when the Constitution was being made, the Australian-born British political scientist C.C. Weir wrote a book, Federal Government. Now, the fourth edition of the book was published in 1964, the year, the end of the Nehru year, end of the Nehru era in Indian politics. In the fourth edition of the book, C.C. Weir characterized the Indian Constitution as well as the Indian government as quasi-federal. He thought that the Constitution of India is quasi-federal or half-federal, not fully federal, and the working of the Nehru government, according to Weir, was also quasi-federal or half-federal. C.C. Weir was measuring the nature of the constitutions, federal constitutions that he studied against the American model. And compared to the American model, states in India have lesser powers, quantum of powers granted to the states is less far going than in the Indian Constitution, and that's why Weir considers Indian Constitution. For that matter, Weir also said that the Canadian Constitution was also quasi-federal, half-federal. But in 1964, C.C. Weir said that the Constitution of Canada was quasi-federal, but the working of the Canadian government by that time when he wrote had become federal. About India, Weir said that the Constitution of India was quasi-federal, as well as the working of the Nehru government under the Constitution was quasi-federal. Now, we have moved away from that time, and by this time, almost any writer on Indian politics, on Indian federalism, Indian or foreign, agrees that India has now become federal. It's no longer accurate or correct to call India quasi-federal or less than federal. In fact, one Canadian writer on Indian federalism, Douglas Verney, has even gone to the extent of arguing that after 1989, during the phase of coalition governments, India became quasi-confederal, in the sense that after 1989, during the phase of coalition governments, state governments and regional parties became so powerful that the central government in actual working became rather weak. In fact, there are, in the past, when the constitution was quasi-federal or less than federal, chief ministers were dismissed by the prime minister or the federal government, whereas during the era of coalition governments, prime ministers could be replaced by the decision of powerful chief ministers or regional parties who formed coalition governments. In fact, a government headed by Atal Bihari Vajpayee, the first NDA government, lost in a parliamentary vote because Jayalalitha, the leader of the DMK, decided to withdraw support to the union government headed by Vajpayee, and the government fell. Now, a greater federalization, we have argued that India has gradually moved from a less federal form of working to a greater federal form of government. So the degree of federalization or degree of federal style of working has been increasing compared to earlier years to the later years. Now, I will argue why this statement is being made. Why are we saying that we have become more federalized today, or at least since 1989? The first indicator of this greater federalization is the reduced incidence of president's rule in states under Article 356 of the Constitution. Article 356 of the Constitution gives power to the central government to dismiss a chief minister or dismiss a state government or dissolve and or dissolve a state legislature if the government of the state is not being run according to the provisions of the Constitution. If the constitutional machinery in a state has broken down in the judgment or in the opinion of the union government, a state government could be replaced, there could be a central intervention, and a government may be dismissed and president's rule may be declared in the state. Now, during the 1950s and 60s, during these two decades, there were 18 instances of president's rule in states. 18 instances in 20 years, 50s and 60s. That was the Nehru era. 18 state governments were dismissed. 1970s and 80s, the number jumped to 58. As many as 58 state governments were dismissed. This was the era of Indira Gandhi and Rajiv Gandhi, by and large. But from 1990s to 2009, the number again dropped, and only 31 governments were dismissed during this period compared to 58 governments in the previous period, that is 70s and 80s. And this decreasing number of central intervention in the states can be taken as an indicator of greater federalization of the Indian political system, in which the state governments were becoming more autonomous, federally more autonomous and independent, autonomous from central interventions. So that's the first indicator of greater federalization. Number two, the second indicator of greater federalization is the decreasing number of president's disallowance of legislative bills of the states reserved by governors for consideration of the President under Article 200 and 201 of the Constitution. The Constitution gives power to a state governor to reserve a bill passed by the state legislature for consideration of the President of India, that means Union government, and the Union government may disallow it, may reject it. So, number of such instances has also been decreasing, and less interventions of this nature are occurring, and that's another reason we are arguing that provincial autonomy or the state autonomy under the federal constitution is increasing. States are becoming more and more autonomous and less constrained or intervened into their affairs by the union government. The third indicator of growing federalization is increase in the discretionary maneuverability of the President of India vis-a-vis the Union Cabinet or the Prime Minister. The President of India, as you know, is bound by the advice of the Council of Ministers, and of course the President can return a proposal to the Cabinet for once only. But after one time referring back the proposal of the Cabinet, if the proposal is returned in the same form to the President must accept it. Now, there are instances during this period, I mean after 1989, when the Union Cabinet presented a proposal to the President and the President returned it for reconsideration or advised the Prime Minister not to act, not to proceed with it. Either the Prime Minister accepted the advice of the President and or the Cabinet did not put forward the same proposal again, kept it with itself. That meant that the President was not forced to sign on it. And therefore, we are arguing that the discretionary powers of the President have increased during this phase, and that is also a measure of federalization. The President is a federal constitutional functionary, and the Prime Minister is a parliamentary officer, parliamentary constitutional functionary, and if the nominal head of the state is having his way, it can be taken as greater maneuverability is attained by the President vis-a-vis in relation to the Cabinet. It means that the federal character of the Constitution or the federal features of the Constitution are coming into greater play. Another indicator is increase in the maneuverability of the state governments in seeking to influence the exercise of the treaty-making power of the Union. The Constitution of India under Article 253 gives exclusive power of signing a treaty or agreement with a foreign country. It's a Union executive's power, and the state governments are not given any explicit right to share in the exercise of this power. But during this phase, post-1989 phase, which we are calling a period of greater federalization, state governments are having a greater influence on the Union government and the signing of treaties with foreign countries. Particularly the border states like West Bengal or Tamil Nadu, border states like West Bengal in relation to treaties with Bangladesh, or border states like Tamil Nadu in relation to treaties or agreements with Sri Lanka, such states are, there have been instances when opposition by the state governments has deterred the central government to proceed and finalize a treaty. Several instances. There is no time to go into the details, but there are several examples. Then, a fifth indicator of greater federalization is the increased role of state governments in economic and industrial policy making, resource mobilization, inviting private capital investment due to factors like changes in the planning process, industrial licensing, privatization, and globalization. Now, 1991 is the period when the socialistic pattern or socialistic paradigm, socialistic pattern of society was replaced by business liberalism and privatization and globalization. And during this phase, the quantum of public investment, state investment, which means central government as well as state governments, public sector investment or public investment is decreasing, private investment in the economy is expanding, private sector is getting greater space, and during this period state governments have been encouraged by the central government itself to go ahead and invite private capital, raise their own resources. Central government no longer is capable of giving financial assistance to the state governments as it once did, and therefore the state governments are now inviting private capital, foreign as well as national as well as multinational, within their respective jurisdictions. And this is also an indicator of growing autonomy of state governments under the federal constitution. Industrial licensing has been abolished. Earlier, any industry to be set up in any state was licensed by the central government. Without central license, no industry could be set up in any state. Now, the system of industrial licensing has been abolished, and it has increased the autonomy of the state governments, economic autonomy of the state governments. Similarly, planning process which had given a very strong grip on the economy of the federal government, of the union government, planning process has also been relaxed, also been reduced in its central control. A highly centralized planning process was turned into an indicative planning, suggestive planning, and now the present Modi government has decided to abolish the planning commission altogether and replace it by another institution. The process in the last meeting of the chief ministers chaired by Prime Minister Narendra Modi, the decision has already been made that the planning commission would be replaced by a new mechanism, a new institution which has been called Policy Commission or Niti Aayog, and the Niti Aayog would be very different from the Planning Commission, and the Niti Aayog would have equal representation from the state governments. The Planning Commission was an exclusively central institution, and the new replacement of the Planning Commission, the Niti Aayog, would have at least 50% representation from the state governments. Now, another indicator of greater federalization is decline in the dominance of national parties, rise in the number and power of regional parties on the heels of growing trend of regional and ethnic identity politics, and the emergence of regional bourgeoisie in agrarian, industrial and commerce sectors. So, this is another indicator, this is another evidence why autonomy of the state governments is increasing. National parties which made it possible for a more centralized governance from New Delhi is now replaced by coalition governments, in which regional parties, powerful regional parties have become partners in the governance in New Delhi, and regional parties and powerful chief ministers greatly influence the formation of the union government as well as decision making in the union government, and to that extent the Indian political system is becoming more federalized, allowing greater autonomy to the state governments. And in several states there has been a rise of regional bourgeoisie. Capitalist farmers have become a very powerful lobby in several states where green revolution has become a reality. Industrial bourgeoisie has emerged in the states where commerce and industry have made great headway, and these regional these classes of regional bourgeoisie in several states also often back regional parties instead of national parties, and that also explains why regional parties have become so powerful. The Akali Dal, for example, has become more powerful after the rise of the capitalist farmers in Punjab, or the TDP, Telugu Desam Party in Andhra Pradesh, has become more powerful because of the rise of commercial and regional bourgeoisie, industrial class in Andhra Pradesh, and so on and so forth. Now, puzzle of federalization versus regionalization is another theme I would like to discuss. So far, the question that I am going to pose now is what we are calling federalization something different? Is what is being called federalization here is really not federalization but something else? Is it regionalization rather than federalization? I am posing this question because federal constitution demands a balance between the federal government and the state governments. Now, what is happening in India, what has been happening in India after 1989 is regionalism gone haywire, regionalism gone wild. Regional parties have often indulged into the kind of political excesses which has made constitutional parliamentary federal governance difficult. The Prime Minister was reduced to a very weak position. After the advent of Modi, things have changed. In the 2014 elections, after 2 decades and a half, for the first time, a single party government has gained a majority in the Lok Sabha, and that has changed the situation a bit. But before 2014 parliamentary elections, from 89 to 2014 May, what really happened was that the Prime Minister was reduced to practically a cipher, because regional parties in his government would reduce his maneuverability, put unreasonable demands on the Prime Minister. The cabinet would be fragmented. The cabinet collegiality or cabinet's collective responsibility to the Lok Sabha would be compromised. Extra parliamentary authorities, extra parliamentary centers of power like a Bal Thackeray in Bombay or a Mamata Banerjee in Calcutta or Jayalalitha in Tamil Nadu, would put unreasonable pressures on the union government, and the constitutional principles of cabinet unity, cabinet collegiality, collective responsibility to the parliament would be compromised. Collective responsibility would be diverted to Bombay, Chennai or Kolkata, and the ministries passed on or ministries allocated to regional coalition partners, regional parties would be treated like fiefdoms, feudal fiefdoms, in which even the Prime Minister could not intervene. And this is one of the reasons why corruption in the UPA government reached astronomical proportions, because regional parties to whom ministries were allocated were treated like personal jamindaris, and even the cabinet and the prime ministers found themselves powerless to intervene. And that's the reason why I am posing the question, what we are calling federalization. Is it really a federalization, or is it actually regionalism gone haywire, or regionalism gone to unconstitutional proportions, unconstitutional to unconstitutional extent. Now I have already made these points, that what you are seeing on the slide now, I have already verbally explained them. The phenomenon of divided government, the mixed phenomenon of divided government, when the government is practically paralyzed, union government, because of the coalitional nature and fragmented control, made it impossible at times for the government to work. But there was at least one good effect of it, in the sense that it compelled the government to proceed with consensus. The government had to create a consensus to make any decision, and the feudal style of functioning whereby the prime ministers in the pre-coalition era decided things without reference to the cabinet. Prime Minister Indira Gandhi proclaimed emergency in the country, destroyed the democratic character of the constitution, declared emergency in the country without even referring the matter to the cabinet. The emergency was proclaimed in the night of 25 January 1975, and the cabinet was convened next morning and was informed about the fait accompli. Emergency had already been declared even without consulting the cabinet, and the Prime Minister went to the President Fakhruddin Ali Ahmad and got signed the proclamation of emergency, and the President also did not raise the question, did not ask the Prime Minister, did you consult your cabinet? Kindly consult your cabinet and come with cabinet consultation and advice, and then I will sign it. President Fakhruddin Ali Ahmad could have, should have raised this question, but he did not, and the Prime Minister did not care for these constitutional niceties or these constitutional principles. So, coalition government has brought about the necessity of creating a consensus following rules and procedures, but because of the excessive fragmentation in the cabinet due to coalition government, due to undue pressures from regional parties and other parties in the coalition, it has become difficult to run the government of the country according to norms of the constitution. So, these are some of the posures that should be discussed in the context of greater federalization of the country, whether we are really moving towards federalization or whether it is regionalization gone haywire. Now, there are some limits in the process of federalization. From our previous discussion, an impression might have been created that we have gone enough in the direction of federalizing the political system of the country. But I would raise a few points here to argue that whatever federalization has taken place by now is somewhat limited. For example, federalization that has happened by now is limited to the political domain. Federalization that has happened is limited to the political domain, and it has not really gone into the area of fiscal and monetary and economic spheres. There is still need for greater federalization in the fiscal affairs, monetary affairs, and in the larger economic spheres of the political system. There has been demand in some quarters, for example, that the state governments should have some say in the appointment of the Finance Commission of India, in the appointment of the Planning Commission of India, in the appointment of boards of the Reserve Bank of India. Planning Commission is of course now under reforms. The Prime Minister has already announced the abolition, and a new replacement of the Planning Commission is being contemplated, and the indications are that the state governments are now going to be given representation on the Planning Commission. Initial ideas, which are not final, suggest that 5 members of the commission would be nominated by the union government and 5 members would be nominated by the state governments. So, this is a good idea, in a sphere where federalism had not taken place at all, is now being looked into, and there is a possibility now that the structure of this institution, the one that is going to replace the Planning Commission, would be more federal in nature than in the past. But the state governments have also been demanding that in the appointment of the Finance Commission of India under a constitutional article, the state government should have some say, and the state government should also be consulted in setting the terms of reference for the Finance Commission. Every 5 years, the President of India appoints a Finance Commission which looks into the finances of the union government and the state governments and makes recommendations for the sharing of the national revenue between the center and the states. A greater federalization of that body is also being demanded, and the government is yet to consider this dimension of federal reforms. Now, states are also critical of the conduct of center's spending power. The Constitution of India divides jurisdictions of the union and the state governments, and the two governments have their separate exclusive jurisdictions, but the Constitution does not prohibit the central government power to government's power to spend in exclusive state jurisdictions. For example, agriculture is an exclusive state subject, but central government has not been prohibited from spending in the agricultural domain. It's a state subject. The state governments would welcome central spending, but the state governments want some say how the central spending is made into their exclusive jurisdictions. So the state governments want some consultation more than what has happened so far in center's spending powers in the exclusive state jurisdictions. States are also critical of center's preponderance in the domain of police power and law and order, which is largely a state subject. Under the Constitution, law and order and police power is largely a state subject, but the state police forces are very weak, unskilled, untrained, poorly financed, and the central police forces have enormously expanded. The central police forces have enormously expanded to an extent that it is almost impossible for the state governments to maintain law and order within their respective jurisdictions with their very poorly trained and very weak police forces. So the state governments would like the center to the state governments of course should raise their own resources, but they would also expect the central government to aid them to improve their police power, and law and order, which is a state subject, should be constitutionally administered such that the union and the states have exercised their powers within the limits of the constitutional demarcation of authorities. It is also argued that the center deliberately neglects the need of strengthening intergovernmental forums of executive federalism like the National Development Council and the Interstate Council. National Development Council was set up by the Nehru government by a cabinet resolution in 1950, and Interstate Council was not set up until 1990. It has been set up in 1990 by the VP Singh government, Janata Dal led National Front government, but the Interstate Council is languishing in the margins. It should be given greater salience in governance. It should be activated, and several commissions like the Sarkaria Commission and the Madan Mohan Panchi Commission on Center-State Relations have argued time and again, recommended time and again to strengthen the Interstate Council. The time is now up, sir, and therefore I would like to conclude.
Right. Thank you so much, sir, for wrapping up well in time, and also to tell our students that this was our very interesting lecture on Indian federalism, and a lot of in-depth discussion and study has been done on this, as has been shared with you. So friends, of course, to promise you, we would be having more lectures by sir in the following month, so stay tuned in for that, and let us thanks also. Thank you, sir, for being here, and thank you, friends. Have a great day.